Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining today for our Financial Issues Forum featuring renowned presidential historian and author Tevi Troy, speaking on his most recent book, The Power and the Money, the epic clashes between commanders in chief and titans of industry. My name is Paul Johnson. I'm the executive director of the Gabelli Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. For those of you joining us for the first time, let me mention that the Financial Issues Forum is a collaboration of three partners: the Museum of American Finance, the CFA Society of New York, and the Gabelli Center for Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. Our goal is to bring renowned experts from many different fields throughout the year to speak on topics and issues that are relevant to the economy, the market, and to you. In a few minutes, I will have David Cowan. In a few minutes, I will introduce Tevi Troy, after which, at about 40 minutes, we will open the dialogue to questions from the field. At that point, I will have David Cowan, President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, join me to handle the questions. You will see at the bottom part of your screen, there is a spot where you can, during the event, and submit your questions, which we will answer as many as possible at the end. All right, all attendees of today's event will receive digital copy of the book, The Power and the Money, with information coming to you following our event. It's a great honor for us to have as our speaker today, Tevi Troy. Tevi is the creator and founder of 1600 Lessons, leadership lessons from our nation's chief executives, obviously an expert in presidential history. His training course is a high-level leadership based on his extensive knowledge of the presidency. He is a best-selling presidential historian and former White House aide and Deputy Secretary of Health. He is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, senior scholar at Yeshiva University Strauss Center, and a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Center. This is his fifth book on presidency. Tevi, I'm delighted to talk to you today. Welcome to our forum.
Well, thanks for having me, Paul. I really appreciate this. I appreciate you calling me renowned in the introduction. I think that's a new one. I don't know how one gets to be renowned, but I appreciate it. And I also have late breaking news in that I've just joined the Ronald Reagan Institute as a senior fellow. So I'm glad to announce that here to you today.
I thought you were renowned before the Ronald Reagan appointee, so I think my comment has just been reinforced by your comment. So, but welcome to the forum. All right, there's a lot to discuss. The book is absolutely terrific. It covers a lot of history, and we're not going to be able to get to all of it. But it feels to me that this relationship between CEOs, titans of industry, as you call them, and the presidency is playing out on a daily basis. So being able to have a historical reference, a historical guide as what's happened before is really powerful, because we can decide whether it feels important. But as I read your book, I realized it's always been important. We tend to live in the environment we're in, but you bring us this perspective that, hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't a lot different than before. So I want to really start with my first question. You in your book, you explore the relationship between various presidents and CEOs. What inspired you to delve into this topic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. And you're so right that it's always been important. And, in life, I guess you'd rather be lucky than good. The timing seems really propitious for me to have this book come out at this moment when everyone's talking about CEO involvement in the White House and all these CEO advisors. But you can't plan things in publishing, as you know. And it just so happened that it came out now. But this has always been an important relationship. As you correctly said, this is my fifth book on the presidency. And in all of my books, I'm addressing the topic of presidents and blank. The blank is something that nobody has covered before, but also speaks to the current moment. And as you know, there have been so many topics covered with the presidency: presidents and pets, presidents and food, presidents and sex, presidents and sports. It's all been covered. So I'm trying to identify something that hasn't been covered, but also has some current resonance. And this issue of CEOs and big business has seemed to me to be getting more and more attention in the last 5 years, especially as both Democrats and Republicans have been tending to denounce big business, even as big business is becoming more and more important in our daily lives. So all these things came together to make me ask this question of, what have the relationships with CEOs and presidents been like in yesteryear, in previous eras? Everybody knows about John D. Rockefeller. Which presidents did he deal with? And then what about J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford and Henry Luce? And I started to go systematically through the great CEOs of our history and to see if they had these relationships with presidents. And lo and behold, a lot of them had relationships with multiple presidents, including Jack Welch from GE, who had relationships with 10 presidents. So he was around for a long time. And that was kind of the opening bid. If you wanted to be a CEO considered for this book, you had to have multiple presidencies that you dealt with. And it also gets to a key point, which is that presidents have one term, maybe 2 terms, but CEOs can live a much longer lifespan in the top seat. And while presidents are very powerful while they're there, the CEOs can have more impact over a longer period. And I wanted to look at that contrast. Presidents who can really do a lot of damage or a lot of benefit to a CEO in the short time that they're in the spotlight, but CEOs have these longer time horizons.
Tevi, I'm going to come back to a question in a minute, but I want to dive in this for a second. There's one more thing you point out in the book, which I think is really important. So we have CEOs that can have long tenure relative to presidents. By definition, they have 4, maybe 2 4-year terms, right? It's capped by design. But they also have to deal with presidents of different parties. It's not like, I think you said Jack Welch, he had a relationship with 10. Well, he didn't have 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. He had a combination. So it's not just dealing with the power of the presidency, it's shifting kind of philosophy or party at the very least.
Yeah, and you have different CEOs take different approaches to this. So Lew Wasserman, who is a Hollywood mogul, who is one of my favorite characters in the book, he is very close to Democrats, especially John F. Kennedy before he was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson. And then when Nixon comes in after the 1968 election, he doesn't much like Republicans. And he has one of his subordinates, a guy named Taft Schreiber, deal with the Nixon administration. But then later, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, even though Reagan's a Republican, he had a pre-existing relationship with
California,
Hollywood and took advantage of that. And then another one who took a different approach is Lee Iacocca, who enters the book as a anti-regulation, pro-free market executive at Ford. And then when he becomes chairman of Chrysler, he recognizes some of the challenges that the auto industry is facing and wants government intervention to help out. And so he becomes much more of a government interventionist. And in the Carter administration, he successfully gets a bailout for Chrysler. But that government interventionist approach doesn't help him so much in the Reagan administration, which is opposed to that kind of government intervention. So shifting back and forth has problematic elements as well.
Well, one of the tensions you clearly point out is if I'm president, a one-term president, I don't get reelected, but presidents often want to be reelected. So they do have this constituency, the American voter, that they have to appeal to as a general concept. And CEOs have a different constituency, maybe the board directly, shareholders slightly indirectly. And you could see how the agendas are quite different. Lee Iacocca is a perfect example, right? He had sort of philosophically, when he's at Ford, leaned toward maybe a traditional Republican economic package. When he got to Chrysler, it became way more pragmatic and said, what's in the best interest of Chrysler? Not so much a philosophical leaning. And I think it feels to me like CEOs have that luxury where presidents don't necessarily do.
Yeah, I think CEOs are wiser not to be too ideological so they can show some malleability. But I will say one small thing in Iacocca's defense. When he was that anti-regulatory executive at Ford, he was specifically lobbying against Naderite regulations that were going to be imposed on the auto industry. And he was trying to get the Nixon administration to overturn what Department of Transportation was trying to do. And he was successful in that effort. So there is a pragmatic element to what they're doing. And I think the most ideological CEOs, I think, have the most problems in trying to deal with presidents, because as you correctly say, it does shift between Democrat and Republican. And even within Republicans, Donald Trump is a very different type of Republican than, let's say, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I think that's important. All right, before we get too far away from history, did you have a favorite story, or is there one story that really stood out in your mind, or segments that you want to highlight?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I do love Lew Wasserman, who is this Hollywood mogul who has no interest in government for years. And then when Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department comes after him, he says, well, wait a minute, I need to get involved in politics. He starts with John F. Kennedy, and then he
Tevi, sorry to interrupt, but you froze for about 30 seconds. Can we go back to the beginning of the answer to this question?
So I really enjoy Lew Wasserman, the Hollywood mogul, who stayed out of politics for a long time, and then he recognized the need to deal with politics and government once Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department came after him for some kind of integration that he was trying to do. And so he befriends presidents, including Lyndon Johnson, with whom he becomes very close. He spends time at the White House with Lyndon Johnson. And before Lyndon Johnson's landslide 1964 election, he goes to Johnson and he says, Mr. President, I have a favor to ask. Now, Johnson tenses up because everybody always wants a favor from him. And what Wasserman says to him is, I want you to promise me I'll never have to serve in government. And at that, Johnson relaxes. But it's a real contrast to some of the CEOs today who are eager to serve in government with all the ups and downs that provides.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm somewhat surprised when somebody who's been wildly successful decides to go to Washington. It's such a different beast. I mean, thank God some people want to do it, but wow, that is fascinating to me. All right. One thing we need to talk about as a backdrop is government regulation kind of as a generic. And the government, I think most people realize government's gotten bigger over time as a percentage of the economic activity, if you will. And regulation has become more expansive over time. You know, sometimes contracts, but it's a longer breadth. And so when you start the book, the government's not very involved in industry. And when you end the book, the government's very involved. You talk about that evolution a little bit?
Yeah, so a couple of things on this. First of all, my chapter on the Rockefeller era, when Rockefeller builds his monopoly, when he goes from nothing in 1870 to the dominant position in petroleum products in 1880, when he has 90% of the refining capacity in the US, there is no government intervention. I call that chapter the blank slate, because government really had no impact on what these people were doing, for good or for ill. But today, you can see that government regulations really affect everything that corporations do in terms of what wages they pay, who they can hire, where they can sell their products. All of these are complex questions that government regulation has some kind of say in. And I graphically depict this in the book in one of the appendices. I believe it's on page 269. And thank you for getting copies for all the attendees. But you look at that graph, it shows the growth of government with some key points at which government grew faster than other times. And the blank slate is gone. And now you've got to go through this thicket of government regulations to figure out how to manage in that environment. And for that reason, I recommend CEOs on their very first day should call in the heads of their Washington office, find out what's going on in Washington, what the threats are, and what kind of team they have to address the challenges that Washington presents.
I think, Debbie, that was my kind of takeaway as I read through the book, is that initially you had kind of certain key CEOs that had to deal with Washington. They go after Rockefeller. Clearly, J.P. Morgan is incredibly important in that era, but it's now feels like almost all CEOs have to be at least somewhat sensitive to going on Washington. Now, smaller companies have fewer resources than big companies, but it feels to me it's almost part of the job requirement these days.
Yeah, not just almost. It is part of the job requirement. If you're not following what's going on in Washington, it can really come to hurt you. And I have these recurring stories, at least 3 stories of CEOs who thought they were too big for Washington. First Rockefeller, then Wasserman, then Gates, who all think that their industry is too insulated, too big, too far away from Washington. Washington's not going to bother them. Bill Gates, in fact, used to have this saying where he would say, the private sector is 3 times faster than the public sector. And the high-tech sector is 3 times faster than the regular private sector. That means we're 9 times faster than government. Well, that's all well and good, but government's also real big. And if it grabs you by the ankle, it's not letting go. And Bill Gates found that to his misfortune in the Clinton era. Even as Bill Clinton was befriending him, playing golf with him, inviting him to White House summits, his Justice Department was going after Microsoft and taking a big bite out of the business.
It's a weird connection. I gave an amicus brief in that investigation in Washington, which was a lot of fun. I've never done anything like that before, but I went down and testified.
And how did Bill Gates do on the witness stand?
Yeah,
Not
well,
good.
not well. Yeah, not well. I argued that they should leave him alone because no success in technology goes unpunished, and that's being challenged now with tech. But at the time, it wasn't long until Microsoft had challengers in other platforms and things like that. Now, you're not just a historian and an author and a lecturer and all that, but you actually worked in government, and you were up close in, I think it was the Bush administration, and you got to see some of this firsthand. And obviously, I assume that influenced your book to some degree.
Without a doubt. I saw CEOs traipsing in and out of the White House all the time. I saw Bill Gates waiting on a bench in the West Wing to see President Bush. I sat in and helped arrange meetings with President Bush and CEOs in the pharma world to deal with flu issues, and CEOs in the food and snack industry to deal with obesity issues, among others. And CEOs even then recognized the importance of government. And if the president wanted to convene them, and it's actually, according to Neustadt, the power of the presidency is the power to convene. That's something I learned in grad school. I saw that firsthand when I was actually working in the West Wing.
Well, Congress has some similar powers, and we had the airline industry in last week defending junk fees on their um, airfares. So Washington clearly continues to have a lot of influence. Now, let's bring it current for a second. And I'm going to go high tech rather than presidency. The high tech industry, I've been following tech for 40 years. It's bigger than ever. It's more profitable than ever. It's more expansive than ever. It's got more influence on our lives than ever. It feels different. But as I read the book, I'm like, maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe this is just the current manifestation. What's your take?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why I call it high tech wave one, high tech wave two. I mean, the Gates era was one era, and as you said, the technology outstripped the regulation. It wasn't really relevant to regulate Microsoft at that point because the new thing after DOS was the browser, and they didn't dominate browsers because they didn't have the best product. And then you're seeing similar things in the high tech industry today, also very powerful, also reshaping our lives. But the technologies are not the same. I mean, even you look at something like Google, which is completely dominant. They may be leading in old search, but they're not leading in AI search, which is a totally different type of search with ChatGPT and the like. And so there's a whole new dominant, new way of potentially becoming dominant in this field. And Google may not have the leg up on this. And the thing I find really interesting is if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, if you go look from 22 to 23 to 24, it's the same, right? Remarkably similar. But if you go from 1990 to 2024, very different. From 1960 to 1990, very different. There's constant turnover as technology changes, regulations change, the tastes of the American people change. I mean, remember Blockbuster Video, right? It was a dominant company in the 90s, and it doesn't exist anymore. And this is a constant thing. And also the FANG stocks, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, the ones that dominate the S&P 500 and responsible for so much of the growth of the S&P 500 in recent years, they didn't exist in the early 1990s. And so the great thing about our capitalist free market system is creative destruction, that companies rise and fall. Now, the company that's falling doesn't much enjoy it, but it's what lets new innovations come to the fore that we can all enjoy.
But I guess that was my comment when I talked about my amicus brief. No success in technology goes punished because of that creative destruction and new things. And as long as technology moves forward, looks like it will, we're going to continue to get that. And I think the other challenge, focusing on the tech companies and government, is antitrust was really built. This is your observation that the regulations don't keep up with the technology. It was really built at a time where monopolies would get often monopoly pricing and therefore gouging customers. And social media's big argument is, hey, we give a lot of this stuff away for free, nominally for free. Certainly the consumer doesn't have to pay at the time of use of the service. So the old rules about that gouging of pricing and the gouging of profits is really a completely different model. It's a scale model now. Often it's ancillary services, advertising, or something else that is driving the monopoly profits. And our regulatory environment can't really deal with that very well because it doesn't fit the old model. And so I think that's one of the challenges. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, you say this stuff is free. Anything where the product is free, you have to recognize whether it's it's what's free, or are you the product, right? Exactly. They're taking advantage of who you are. It's a new pricing model. I remember the late Senator Orrin Hatch was kind of flummoxed by Facebook's business model when he went to testify on the Hill, because this is new cutting edge stuff. But it may not continue in this way. Things are constantly evolving, which is why government keeps getting involved and tries to say, okay, we're going to regulate it this way, we're going to regulate it that way. And that's why CEOs have to interact with government, have to interact with the with the powers that be in Washington, because they have such a huge outsized influence on how things develop with the companies, with the economy, with the market. And so my thought is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The story of the book, the story of the power of the money, is that these CEOs with vision have always found ways to take advantage of new technologies and new opportunities. And government has always said at some point, hold on, you're going a little too fast, you've taken on a little too much. We either want a piece of it, or we want to shape it, or we want to regulate it. And one of the problems that I point out in the book is that each time government says, hold on, we want to regulate it, there's an accretion problem with a new layer of regulations, and it becomes so much that it could have a stifling effect on the economy.
Yeah, I think that's a sub theme. I want to go back. One of the topics that's been in the paper a lot in the last couple of weeks is how much money Elon Musk spent on the election between direct and indirect. It's I don't know, $250 million or something. But in your book, you talk about a very special election where J.P. Morgan, who at the time was the richest man in the country, he had some money thrown out in an election. And I think it's important for our audience to understand that this too is not new.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about that McKinley election where J.P. Morgan spent almost as much on the McKinley race, who was the Republican, as the entire Democratic race spent in total. It was something like 70% of the total Democratic spending was equivalent to just what J.P. Morgan contributed. So, yeah, the money in politics is not a new thing. In fact, Mark Hanna, who was a key advisor to McKinley, used to famously say there's three things important in politics. There's money, and I forgot the other two.
I like that. All right. I want to come back to high tech for a second. Does it, you're the historian, you're the expert on all this. You've seen this a lot over time. You've seen different industries, is there anything about this high tech kind of influence right now that feels different than the stories, or is it just fits in the pattern?
I mean, look, the thing about history, the thing I love about history is you can always find similarities with previous eras. You can find echoes of the past. But just because it can inform or illuminate the past doesn't mean it will predict the future. So it can tell us, oh, we've seen this before, and here are some things that worked and some things that didn't work, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out the same way. And so, yeah, there's a lot of similarities with what I see in high tech in the previous high tech wave with Rockefeller. But at the same time, these products are so influential in our daily lives. In 1870, when Rockefeller starts his empire, you had very little interaction on a daily basis with corporations or the federal government. Now, every day, you have some interaction with both corporations who build the cars we drive, develop the fuel that we put in the cars, have the communications devices that we have in our pockets, develop the content that we see through these communications. So the corporations are very involved, but also government regulates and subsidizes our schools, regulates and subsidizes our roads, regulates and subsidizes our food. So government's very involved in our daily lives, and corporations are involved in our daily lives in a way that was not so back in 1870 when I start the story.
So it could look similar, but the outcome could be very different. I mean, it's unpredictable, but it could be a very different outcome than what we've seen in the past.
Right, but some general things are true that, as you say, technology will outstrip the regulations. Some new person will take advantage of it. That person will make a lot of money and accumulate a lot of power. There will be resentment by certain politicians who call for regulation and some kind of level of higher taxation for this individual or for wealthy people in general. And then the regulation will come into effect, and eventually a new technology will outstrip that. So there's a cycle that will recur. And you could see echoes of it in each cycle, but it won't play out exactly the same way.
I think that's an excellent point. So we can take some from history, but it's not predictive necessarily. And I think that's the key. This looks like something in the past. Outcome could be very different because everything's a little different. All right, now it's obviously the relation. You focus on the relationship between the commander in chief and these titans of industry, but the interaction is really multiple layers in the government, because the president can set direction, influence, try to lobby a bit, but they don't set regulation. They may influence it, they may set a direction, they may get congressmen and women to support it. But talk a little bit about what else corporations do related to the government when it comes to regulation and policy.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of theories about regulation corporations. There's ideas that there's regulatory capture, which suggests that it's the corporations that run the regulatory process. In my experience, that's not necessarily the case, but they certainly do want to have an influence on it. And one reason that big corporations like regulation is because regulation can be a barrier to entry. If you have a very complex regulatory scheme, it's harder for a smaller, innovative entrepreneurial company to deal with that complex regulatory scheme. And so the big companies who can afford lawyers and lobbyists and compliance officials, they are much better at dealing with the existing regulatory regime than a smaller, newer, younger company. That said, the smaller, newer, younger company is often more maneuverable and can react more quickly to changes, and they can adapt to the regulations. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game on both sides.
It feels a bit that in healthcare that the regulation has gotten to be so phenomenally difficult that it's hard for, I'm not an expert in that area, but it'd be hard for me to see a lot of entrance because of what you just said. The regulatory environment is so steep. I think financial services are probably somewhat similar that way.
Yeah, it's true. But then sometimes you see, let's say in the chip world, you didn't think there'd be a new player until NVIDIA comes around, and suddenly they're.
Although but that's not as regulated. That's really driven by Moore's law more than anything else. Next topic, you make the comment sort of in general, you made the comment earlier and you made the comment in the book that you think both Democrat and Republican parties appear to be anti-corporations. Now, in a sense, not new for the Democrats. They cited different regimes have different feelings, but over the history, they tended over the last 50 years be more anti-corporation than Republican. For a very long time, most of my life, Republicans were really pro-corporate, pro-business, pro-corporation, pro-business. And it feels like that's changed. Is that your take as well?
Yeah, I wrote this book before the 2024 election, obviously. It came out even before the 2024 election. And I wonder if I might have moderated a little bit what I said on that after the results of the election, because obviously you see there's kind of this corporate embrace of the Trump administration and the Trump embrace of all these CEOs. But that said, I don't change my view that you have certain Republicans, Josh Hawley, including and the current or vice president to be J.D. Vance, who have used more anti-corporate rhetoric and I think are critical of corporations and the role they play. And I think those people will also have a voice in the Trump administration. So right now, it looks like it's good times for corporations, but that may not necessarily be the case once all the chips are settled and we see who is in the key regulatory positions in the new administration.
I think that for me, the key is who really gets in the positions and then not only what they want to do, but what they can do. Because I think this, I don't want to get into politics, but I think the current incoming president has more of a desire to have a relationship with CEOs than the prior administration, for sure. Independent of how that plays out, he just is more receptive to the visit, I think, than Biden was. But at the very least, he's more visible about the visit. Maybe Biden saw as many CEOs as Trump looks like he will see, and we just didn't see it. As you said, a lot of this is behind the scenes. So I think it's yet to play out. I think you obviously had what you had to write the book. I think it'd be premature to adjust that until we're 6-9 months into the new administration, personally, for what it's worth.
Again, it's a book I'm very happy with, and I stand by it. So I'm not looking to change anything, but what's happened in the last 2 months just has made me think a little bit more about how this is going to play out with the Republicans and CEOs. It looked like the trend line was towards more Republicans becoming more anti-corporate. And I'm just not sure, given the results of the election and the reaction of some of the CEOs, even Trump said everyone was against me last time, and now now they all want to be my friend. And it just makes me rethink how it's going to play out.
Elon and Vivek are going to run an advisory. It's not a committee. It's not controlled by Congress, but they're certainly going to try to go after deregulation in some form, government efficiency. Now, as we look at the numbers and things, there's vast majority of this no one can touch, blah, blah, blah. But do you think that is something that can catch hold? You talked about we get layers of regulation. We almost never get that deregulation, cut out those old rules that really you couldn't get past today, and they don't really apply to the modern world. Do you think that somebody from the outside could be effective at that?
Yeah, look, we've long had this fantasy that a businessman will come in and change things and make the government more efficient. Look, the government is inefficient because it's designed to be inefficient, and so it's not so easy to change things. But we have had corporations involved in trying to reform things before. The Grace Commission in the Reagan years was trying to improve government efficiency. And I'm all for finding the inefficiencies and seeing if we can target them. The problem with government is that there's always someone who benefits from the inefficiency, and that person will have some kind of champion in Congress. I mean, look especially at the public sector labor unions. They like the fact that government is inefficient and you can't fire poor performers and the people don't have to show up every day. That's the benefit they offer to their workers. And they certainly have a lot of champions in Congress, especially on the Democratic side, because they offer a lot of money to Democrats to maintain that kind of system. So it's not so easy to make the changes. That said, having studied Elon Musk for The Power and the Money, and also having read the Walter Isaacson book on him, the guy is really good at spotting inefficiencies. I mean, Isaacson would talk about how he would go up and down the production line and see something that wasn't maximally efficient. And he'd say, why are we doing it this way? And if your answer was just, that's how we've always done it, you're out. That was not an acceptable answer. You had to have a justification. And usually the justification was insufficient, and they would find a way to improve things, which is why Tesla is such a well-designed automobile. And that's why he's been so good at creating all these different companies.
Yeah, I'd push back a little bit. I don't think that's why he's been so successful. But you're the guest, so we'll go with your version. However,
there are many reasons he's successful. Let's put it that.
Yeah,
spotting inefficiencies, I thought was a special skill.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Now, I think we've had a lot of people that have been good at spotting inefficiency in government, and those same people have been wildly ineffective at getting anything done. And the question is now, since this was a big part of the incoming administration's platform, presumably influence people to get elected, curious if they'll have more power this time. But as you said, every regulation, there's somebody who benefits from it. And that person has a deep interest in making sure that regulation continues.
Right. I mean, there's two sides to this spotting inefficiency thing. One is spotting it, which Musk has a good eye for. The other is being willing to dig in your heels and make sure it gets changed. Now, Musk was willing to do that in the corporate world and his companies that he controlled. Can you do that in government? Will Trump back him up? Will the regulatory apparatus allow it to happen? Do these things have to go through Congress? Will Congress allow them? These are all questions that are just made harder by the machinery of government. And so we'll see. But at the very minimum, it'll be really useful to have this catalog of all the various inefficiencies that we have in government. And maybe they won't be solved in the 4 years of Trump too, but maybe over time they can be things that can be targeted and we can get rid of some of them over a longer time horizon.
You know, it's interesting you say that. I think that there's huge merit if somebody could come along and catalog important ones, maybe the little ones as well, but important ones. And then if that got published, in a sense, everybody was aware of it, and a lot of people probably would agree. And maybe that transparency would make it easier to address in the future. These two guys, they're got their fingers in lots of stuff. They're wildly successful, financially equally as successful. I'm curious if they would be satisfied with just publishing a catalog of inefficiencies. Somehow, I doubt it, but maybe that'd be pretty cool. I think for me, it's Elon's. He's got a few businesses to run, and he's got a few more of these probably thinking. How much time does he really have to devote to this?
It's a good question, and this government stuff takes a lot of time. I thought the approach that Ramaswamy and Musk took in their Wall Street Journal piece, where they said that they would use Loper Bright, which was the decision that got rid of Chevron deference, to address regulations directly and eliminate them without necessarily going through the administrative process, was an interesting approach. It will certainly be challenged in court if they try it, but maybe they win. Who knows? So I think that's an open question. The way I've been describing the DOGE is the most powerful government commission in history. It has the most attention. It has the most potential. But at the heart, it's still a government commission. And just because it's called the Department of Government Efficiency doesn't mean it's an actual cabinet department with the regulatory powers invested in it. It can at most advise and say, we should get rid of this. And then it's up to Trump and his administration to do it.
Yeah, but you just going back to one thing, you do need, as you said, government moves slowly, and you need a real dedication. It's a great effort, as you said. It's certainly the most visible, probably in history. A topic that a lot of people, I think, respond well to. Almost everybody's had a frustrating story or two, but I think you need someone, the people that run it, to stick around for a little while and really dive in, devote a lot of time, and have a work product that's usable. And I just, echoing what I said, I'll be curious how devoted these two gentlemen are. They're incredibly talented and have lots of opportunities to spend their time on other fun things.
Look, we talked earlier that I served in government, and I saw a lot of people. They came and they went without really accomplishing much. And you can't do everything. You need to focus on a few small number of things that you can accomplish and that you're going to devote your time and attention to. And I tried to do that when I was at the Department of Health and Human Services, and I also followed in the model of my boss and mentor, Mike Levitt, who was the secretary. He said, "There are 5 things I'm working on, Tevi. I'm going to devote every minute I can to those 5 things because the rest of it, I can't change everything. I'm going to work on those 5 things." And some of the things he made a lot of progress in, like flu preparation and health information technology. But you just can't do everything in government. And so these guys have a wide purview and a lot of ideas and insights and a lot of energy. But we'll see how it plays out.
We talked, and I think you framed it really well on this call, that it's too early to know where the current administration is going to fall. We don't know the people that will be in place. We don't know which policies will be put forward. Are there any telltale signs you would look for, whether or not it's going to kind of follow the recent trend that JD Vance's, the Hartley, regulate, be more anti-corporation, or it's going to lean the other way? Is there any signs you would look for that say, hey, wait, we're breaking one way or the other?
Well, I would say that in general, it's been a more pro-corporate environment since Trump was reelected, in that he's had good relations with these CEOs. They're all coming to see him. They're donating money to his inauguration. So those are positive signs on the corporate involvement front. At the same time, Robert F. Kennedy has been a critic of corporations. So some of the people who are coming into government might be critical. Obviously, Vice President-elect Vance is a critic of corporations. Vice President often has a lot of say in staffing questions. So I would say in general, the corporations, if it were a stock, and it actually is a stock, and the stock market has been going up, I would be bullish. But you can be bullish without being right.
Yeah. No, I live in the markets every day. I know that all far too well. All right, last formal question for me, and then we're going to open it up to questions. For the readers of the book, what should they think about what's the main takeaway concerning what's the frame or the main takeaway that you think people should take away from reading your book?
Other than a fascinating and entertaining story, the number one takeaway is that these relations between governments and especially presidents and CEOs have been going on for a very long time, and they have a huge ability to shape the daily lives around us. And we as citizens need to be cognizant of this so that we can have our say as well.
All right, we're going to now shift and take some questions from the audience. I'm going to have David Cowan join me momentarily.
Thank you, Paul and Tevi, for that engaging conversation. And we've started to have questions come in, so please send them in if you have one to ask. The first one's coming from Gregory Gosek. Tevi, which president had the greatest influence on business and, interestingly, closest relationships to CEOs after he left office, and how did he use it and those paydays they get for their talks?
Well, I'm sorry, are those two separate questions? Which one had the biggest impact on which relations after, or is it?
So one is who had the greatest influence on business, and the second, who had the closest relationship to CEOs after he left office, and how did he use it?
So I would say the biggest impact on business would have to be Teddy Roosevelt, who changed the way government deals with corporations. He created the Bureau of Corporations. He showed that government could break up trusts and monopolies. He showed that this anti-corporate rhetoric could be effective in winning elections. He showed that Republicans weren't necessarily lockstep pro-business but had different perspectives. So business may not like it, but Teddy Roosevelt definitely had the biggest impact. In terms of relationships with CEOs afterwards, I think we'd have to look at Barack Obama, who's signed many lucrative contracts with many companies, does a lot of speaking, had that massive deal with Netflix. I mean, he seems to be monetizing his post-presidency in a very effective way, and that doesn't happen without corporate involvement.
It's interesting to watch. All right, next question comes from Xavier O'Neill. How does the government maintain these regulatory powers with offshore or secretive entities like hedge funds? I think given the power that some of these large hedge funds have and the ability for them to kind of finance around government, how does the government maintain its power, regulatory power, when you've got these other entities?
Yeah, it's interesting. My brother worked for a big corporation, and he'd say the most powerful people in the world aren't the CEOs of these big corporations, but the hedge funds who are investing in them. And if they, go short on a corporation or decide that this corporation is a bad bet, it can have devastating impacts on the companies. Look, there are financial regulations that impact any type of investment operation, and CEOs of hedge funds have to comply with them like anyone else. But I think hedge funds are in some ways an innovation. They decide not to be like the big banks, not to have the direct consumer involvement. Not anybody can enter, and I think those barriers to entry just for the investors limit the regulatory impact that the government has on them, because a lot of the regulations in the financial sphere are for consumer-facing businesses, and these really aren't consumer-facing to the same degree. And I think that helps them deal with the regulatory environment and lets them be a little more nimble.
Debbie, just as a follow-up, just as a fascination, over the last 18 months, the largest hedge funds or asset gatherers like BlackRock and related are building out direct to consumer businesses. They're literally what you and I might call stockbrokers, registered representatives, but these client-facing individuals are building these out because they want direct access to individuals to bring in those assets to put them into their asset machine. Now, they're not as secretive maybe as some of the hedge funds, but we're seeing that trend actually break another way, where they're actually now going direct to consumers. And so I think their involvement in potential regulation is going to shift as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, but they're going to have to think about that. I mean, just like I was saying, every CEO should be talking to their Washington team about how what Washington is thinking or doing is going to affect them. I think going more into that heavy direct-to-consumer access business might open them up to more capital. It might make them more user-friendly, but it also will open them up to new regulatory possibilities and concerns.
Leo Schmidt wants to know, how did the FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt relationship change pre-World War II and during World War II?
That is a terrific question, and really is very important and a key part of the book. So let's just look at one CEO who I talk about in the book, is Henry Ford, who does not like FDR. I was very critical of him, doesn't like the New Deal, doesn't like the so-called Blue Eagle that is put on businesses that are favored by the National Recovery Administration. He says, I don't want that blue buzzard on my businesses. But then World War II comes around, and patriotic Americans turn around a little bit on things. Henry Ford builds the largest armaments plant at Willow Run in Michigan, and FDR, despite their enmity, comes out and visits him. They take a driving tour of the factory. That's how big it was. You had to drive around it in a Ford, of course. And so business becomes very important in the development of U.S. manufacturing of armaments that are badly needed in World War II. The U.S. just didn't have the armaments it needed before Pearl Harbor, and it had to get up to stock very, very quickly. And it's corporate people like Knudsen is one of them, who also came from the auto industry. He had a big influence in this. And so I think the relationship with FDR and the businesses, which was pretty hostile before World War II, changes. And in fact, that's one of the things where that lets the businesses and the economy do better after we enter World War II and the official New Deal era ends, because Roosevelt says, I'm stopping being Dr. New Deal and I'm becoming Dr. Win the War. And the economy loosens up, and this has implications going on to not only the late 40s, but in the 50s in the Eisenhower administration. We have a very powerful economic engine that is somewhat unburdened by the onslaught of new regulations that FDR kept bringing until the war started.
Tevi, Vladimir Augustine has two questions. I'm going to ask the first question, and then after that, I'm going to come back with the second question. I just think that'll be easier. He frames this as something called the Amazon effect. I think this effect could apply to other technology companies. So on the one hand, Amazon has brought lower company margins and marketplace prices, both on their distribution business, the retail business, as well as AWS. They've been very aggressive in both, trying to pass on the retail side, somewhat similar to Walmart. On the AWS side, as technology moves, costs come down, they pass it on to the consumer right away. As a competitive strategy, it's very smart, but in both cases, the consumer really has very favorable read of Amazon and would, I think, be anti any kind of government involvement in breaking that model. At the same time, there are competitors and there are laborers and things that feel very differently about Amazon. There's lots of stories that Amazon will pick the highest volume products on their website and see if they can replicate that. The Amazon brand is called Amazon Basics, and you can get that in everything from electronics to clothing. And so people that compete with Amazon feel very differently than maybe a consumer does. And then, of course, the distribution workers, we just hear the stories. I'm not intimate with the details of a lot of frustration. So if you're the government, how do you deal with a company that the consumer is delighted by the experience, and yet many other people are very frustrated? It reminds me a bit of Microsoft, I guess, although the Microsoft products were never as good as the Amazon product. How does government deal with that? And then I'll come back with the second question.
No, I think you're right to point to Microsoft, but also Standard Oil. Right, the consumers were benefiting in getting cheaper, better, safer oil, and at the same time, Rockefeller's competitors were being driven out of business by not only his tactics but his better products. So this stuff has echoes throughout history, and none of it is new. But some of the stuff you talk about is precisely why you have this new kind of anti-business Republican. They don't necessarily like the way that it pushes mom and pop shops out of business or smaller competitors out of business. And I think that has an influence on the way these companies are viewed. For the last 3 decades or so, U.S. antitrust policy has been governed by Robert Bork's theories on antitrust, which is bigger's not a problem as long as the consumers benefit. And in many ways, the consumers have benefited from this high-tech revolution. But the new folks in antitrust, which include left-wingers like Sanders and Senator Warren and Lina Khan, are in some ways in lockstep with some of these conservative anti-business folks who think that it's not just a question of do the consumers benefit, but does the society benefit? Do the small entities benefit? Do the competitors benefit? And they take more stuff into account in making their antitrust decisions.
Yeah, I think that when you have scale businesses, Rockefeller was that, it's a tricky balance because the benefit to the consumers from the scale, and they clearly benefit. At the same time, innovation and competition, at least in theory, is what drives and keeps prices lower. So I do think the way you framed it's exactly right. We have a very different non-Borkian view of, a more expansive view of what the impact of this is. Now, the second question is sort of anticipated and probably answered, but let me ask it anyway. Could Rockefeller and Standard Oil done anything differently to prevent the company's breakup, or was it just inevitable given the environment?
Well, he could have been a different person is one thing. But one thing that I talk about in the book that I think is really relevant to this is the way Rockefeller ignored bad press and ignored political interest in him and his company until it was too late for him to do anything about it. So I think if they had been more attuned to the press, and look, you can't really blame him because it was before the era of press agents. In fact, Rockefeller has the first press agent, a guy named Ivy Lee, but it's too late. It's after his reputation is so sullied. But Rockefeller, I think, was insufficiently attentive to the negative publicity and the negative press he was getting. He told his people just to soldier on and ignore it. And I think that was a bad strategy.
I'm wondering, when it goes wrong for some of these CEOs. For instance, last year we had Sam Bankman-Fried, major donor, and it certainly didn't work out for him. Any other cases are big ones in history that you remember where the CEOs definitely overstepped that you haven't mentioned?
Well, Ken Lay and Enron. I mean, there's definitely cases like this. But this actually gets to one of the things I was trying to get at in The Power and the Money, which is I wasn't looking for bad guys. I was looking for people who ran these iconic businesses, were in some ways business heroes. And the closest I think we have to a villain is Henry Ford, and largely not because of his business practices, but because of his anti-Semitism, which he did later renounce, and he did have many Jewish friends. And I'm not trying to minimize his anti-Semitism because it was terrible, but even he didn't remain an anti-Semite to the end, and actually had some remorse about what he had seen when he saw what the Nazis had done. So I'm trying not to focus on bad guys in the book, just people who are trying to do the best in a competitive and often heavily regulated environment, who many of them brought real great innovations to Americans' homes. And so I'm not focused on CEOs who went to jail or had massive scandals. And for the most part, the people in this book don't fit in those categories.
It's interesting you bring up Ken Lay. Ken Lay was given an ambassadorship. And when you get that appointment, you have as an option to sell all of your personal holdings. And he elected to put it into a blind trust.
Whoops.
And if he had sold, he would have sold near the high. And by putting it in the blind trust, either he was naive or he truly believed, or maybe was just an idiot. But I've always been fascinated by that because he had a free option to sell everything and he didn't. So he went on. All right.
You never know this stuff. When I became Deputy Secretary of Health, I had to sell all of my holdings. And some of it I thought was ridiculous. I had to sell energy stocks, even though I was going into the health. But, I did it. And it was right before the financial collapse. So sometimes the stuff works out.
It would have worked out better for him. All right. Susan Weed asks, which president was most effective? You may or may not have this, most effective with deregulation.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we haven't seen enough of it. I mean, I always like to look at Calvin Coolidge, but it was a different era. I mean, he actually balanced the budget and he believed in a smaller government and took steps to make it happen. I mean, even Ronald Reagan, who talked about deregulation, he more slowed the growth of government than actually bringing it back. Similar with Trump. I mean, in some ways, Trump with his 2-for-1, meaning you have to have get rid of 2 regs for every reg you put into place. I think he may have been more successful in that front than others. George W. Bush, for whom I worked, really did try to do deregulation, but in the end, I think there were more pages in the Federal Register at the end of his presidency than at the beginning. So it's hard. I mean, deregulation is hard, but I still think it's a worthy endeavor.
Robert Langrick wants to know, do you think Musk will push to shrink or close NASA? Maybe a little self-interest there, huh?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But the fact of the matter is it's not a Musk thing necessarily, because the reason Obama goes to visit Musk and SpaceX back in 2009 or so is that, I think it was 2010, but the reason he goes to visit him is because he wanted alternatives to NASA. So there's a recognition that NASA can't do everything and that sometimes the private sector can be more efficient and do things better. And so I don't think Musk is going to say, let's close NASA because NASA is my competition. But I think the government is increasingly realizing that NASA is not the answer to everything and that you do need to have these private companies if we're actually going to accomplish our goals in space.
Leo Schmidt comes back with a similar question we've really talked about, but a little bit of a nuance. If you use Robert Bork's test of antitrust, he claims it misses the point with Google because the search model feels free when I use it, but in fact, it's not. Even to me, there is a direct cost. If nothing else, I have all those sponsored ads, and an indirect cost in that they use the data. And so therefore, isn't it possible that we could actually use the Bork model? We just have to redefine what the cost to the consumer is. And it would be consistent with Robert Bork's thought. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, so first of all, welcome back, Leo. Thanks for coming up again. But second of all, I do think there is something to be thinking about here, because I mentioned earlier that if the product is free, maybe consider whether you're the product, which is the whole approach that Google is taking. And I don't know that anybody has done the work on this, but I think it would be a good question of how you apply the Borkian thought in a Google world. I mean, what kind of economic analysis would you have to do to figure out what are my increased costs as a consumer, even if they're indirect, of using these free Google search models? And And there are costs in terms of privacy and being hit with ads that you didn't even know that you wanted these things, but Google somehow did know.
Well, plus you have the cookies that follow you around forever. So yeah, I think that Leo brings up a great point. If we redefine cost, maybe we can stay in the Borkian world and still find that these businesses are not as clean or as innocent as maybe they want you to believe.
Yeah, I think it's a great point.
Any thoughts on tariffs, potential tariffs? Is that a collision course for CEOs? Are they going to be happy because they're domestic based and maybe they'll be more competitive? Any big picture ideas on that?
Yeah, look, it's definitely an issue that a lot of CEOs, especially of American-based companies, like tariffs because they can be beneficial to them. But like Leo was saying, there are costs involved also with tariffs. And I'm more in the David Ricardo school of free trade is best for all. But it also free trade works best if you have, I would say, above board players, and the Chinese don't always play above board. And I'm not even sure Trump likes tariffs as much as he likes unilateral weapons that he can wield. And if he can say, I'm going to tariff you and get Justin Trudeau to fly down and say, hey, what can we do to avoid this? Or to get Claudia Sheinbaum, and neither of these are politicians who are inclined to like Trump or his ideology, to say, hey, what can we do about the border so that we don't have to deal with these tariffs? I think Trump likes having the weapon, and I don't think he's necessarily reading his David Ricardo when he's making these decisions.
All right, we have one more question, which is from Robert Langrick. He said the fact that Trump will now be a one-term president, he's a two-term president, does that reduce the incentive to lobby or increase them in the short term? The fact that he can't run again, does that make it more interesting or less interesting for CEOs, or sort of neutral?
Look, when you are at this point where the remaining Trump presidency is 4 years and a month right now, you got to deal with those 4 years and a month. And you can't really think about, oh, well, I can wait him out and then I won't have to worry about it. Now, maybe in the third year of a presidency, you can start thinking like that. But right now, you can't. What can this guy do? And there's only a limited number of things that a president can do, but it's still a lot of things. And if you can get him to focus on that rather than on this, you will be better off as a CEO if that's this is something that would have been detrimental to your business.
So I want to thank you, we have one that just came in under the wire. Why don't we do one more? Jay LeBlanc, have any foreign business leaders been effective developing relationships with presidents, or do they defer to foreign leaders?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It seems to me from my research, less frequent. American presidents just less likely to take the call from a foreign business leader. But also, there's something about the American spirit and the American drive and innovation that a lot of these big companies, the majority of the big companies, are being formed in America. Maybe it's because we have more of a free market. A lot of the ideas develop here. Maybe because we bring in the best talent from different countries, and I hope we can fix our immigration policies so that we can attract good talent while not necessarily being overrun with people who don't come here and follow the rules. And so it's two things going on. One is presidents are less interested in taking the call from a foreign leader, but second, America has been a conducive place to invent new products, new businesses, new industries, and that's why the story of the power of the money is so interesting.
Well, thank you, Tevi and Paul, for another phenomenal event. Great time. To our audience, this concludes our 2024 programming. We had 15 free events. It was terrific. So from the Fordham's Gabelli School and our colleagues and friends, Paul Johnson, Jim Kelly, Suresh Chatterjee, the CFA Society of New York, and from the staff and team here at the Museum of American Finance. Warm holiday wishes. We are looking forward to more phenomenal programming in 2025 and hope you join us then.